All right. Chapter 16 is the spinal cord and spinal nerves. We are going to basically, as we do, pick up where we left off. We discussed the brain and cranial nerves last week or last whenever, and now we are discussing the spinal cord and spinal nerves. We're going to try to keep spinal nerves focused on just a few. And the spinal cord is structurally part of the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Functionally, it does all of the overlapping functions of the nervous system, including collecting information. So we have sensory nerves coming into the spinal cord. We have interneurons doing integration, and we have motor neurons sending responses out. So functionally, it does all of the functions of the nervous system, but structurally, it is part of the central nervous system. It is providing the link between the brain and the rest of the body. Spinal nerves have two very important functions. We have sensory and motor impulses. Again, we have overlapping functions. We have input, output. And then we also have this concept of reflexes, which we'll talk about later in this chapter. Reflexes are quick reactions. Some of them are innate and some of them are learned. Quick responses to stimuli that don't require a projection up to the brain. So the first thing we want to cover is the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is not as big as you think it is. It may be just about as thick as my pinky. You'll take a look at it in the lab. And it extends from the base of the skull. It comes out through foramen magnum, just inferior to the brainstem, which we discussed last week. And it projects down to the L1 vertebra, which is kind of weird. You know, L1 is definitely not the end of the spinal column or the spine, the bony bits of the spine, but it is the end of the nervous tissue that forms the spinal cord. Weird. It is embryology, and we don't talk about embryology, but if you think about it in the developing fetus, the spinal cord is actually as long as the spinal column, but then we grow and we do endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification and all interstitial growth and appositional growth, and the bone and connective tissue that form the vertebra grow faster than the spinal cord, and so you end up with a slightly shorter spinal cord, but you still have to innervate. You still have to innervate the inferior portions. You still need spinal nerves to innervate muscles. So instead of having an actual spinal cord, it's not that the spinal cord just ends, it's the cylindrical structure that ends. Then you have what's called a fanning out. It's a fanning out of nerves right here from L1, L2-ish down to the coccyx, and it's called cauda equina. Right here, it's called cauda equina, which literally translates to a horse's tail. So you have this fanning out of nerves inferior to L1, L2. The spinal cord has some gross anatomy structures, one being cauda equina, two being this tapered end. So it is cylindrical in shape. It has two enlargements. It has a cervical enlargement right here, and a lumbosacral enlargement. So it kind of has, let's see if I can draw. It kind of, oh boy, it kind of has, I haven't used this tool in quite some time. This is an exaggeration, but it kind of does this. It becomes enlarged in the cervical region, and then it gets a little thinner in the thoracic region, and then it gets thicker again in the lumbosacral region, and that is because that is where we innervate. That is where nerves project from the spinal cord to innervate muscles of the upper limbs, muscles of the lower limbs, which we will talk about plexuses later. So we have cauda equina, which is the horse's tail. It's the fanning out of nerves inferior to the tapered end of the spinal cord. The tapered end, you can see it right here. I promise you, well, I don't promise you, but probably you will see these structures much more clearly in the lab with both cadavers and models. Conus medullaris is the tapered conical inferior end of the spinal cord. And then you have those enlargements I'm not going to talk too much about the projections out of the spinal cord because we will look at them when we look at the cross section. You have these basically wires. They're like wires. They are like cables. They are nerves, and they're called rootlets. You also have this groove in the spinal cord, which is, it runs along the posterior end of it, and you have one on the anterior end. You have, we'll take a look at it, the cross section, words. You have a posterior median sulcus and an anterior median fissure. So right here, we could see it a little bit in the gross anatomy, but posteriorly you have this groove. Just like in the brain, we have sulci, the posterior median sulcus, and on the anterior side, you have an anterior median fissure. Fissure is supposed to be a deeper structure, but the sulcus looks like a deeper structure. The parts of the spinal cord are cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, just like the bones of the vertebral column. The spinal cord changes in its anatomy as we go from superior to inferior. It changes in shape, and it also changes in the distribution of gray matter versus white matter. So if we look at the cervical part, it's got kind of this ovular shape. We've got lots of white matter, and then we have this butterfly shape of gray matter. That's the gray matter. When we look at thoracic, it starts to get a little more narrow since we just mentioned the cervical and thoracic enlargement. The cervical and lumbosacral enlargements. And then when we look inferiorly, the lumbar and sacral regions of the spinal cord are much more round, much more circular, and something else changes. The other thing that changes is the distribution of gray matter, white matter. What we see is the gray matter thick. We have more gray matter versus white matter in the inferior portions of the spine. Okay, we have spinal nerves projecting out from the spinal cord, and they are named by region and number. There is one minor difference between spinal nerves and vertebral bones, and that is the existence of 8 cervical nerves, even though we only have 7 cervical bones. So we have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and 1 coccygeal. Let me move my face so that you can see. And what I'm showing here is just a longitudinal section where you can see the projection of spinal nerves, either superior or inferior to the bone that they are named for. So the one difference that we have is that we have 8 cervical nerves. The first one, C1, is going to project out of the spinal cord and travel out from the spine, from the vertebral column, superior to C1, or Atlas, our friend Atlas, who holds the world on his shoulder. And then each subsequent nerve is going to do the same thing. So C2 travels above or superior to the bone, number 2. And then when we get to number 8, the 8th cervical nerve projects out of the spinal column below or inferior to C7 bone. And then when we get into the thoracic region, they are below. Okay, let's talk about meninges. My face. Let's talk about meninges. Meninges, that we have 3 spinal meninges in the spinal column, just like we had 3 cranial meninges in the brain. We have the dura mater, which means tough matter, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. There's a minor difference there, so they are continuous. They travel from the brain down into the spinal, and down into the spinal cord. They are continuous with the cranial meninges. We still have an epidural space. This is where epidural anesthesia is given. But unlike the cranial meninges, the dura mater in the spinal cord has only 1 layer. In the cranial meninges, we saw the spinal cord we saw the dura mater separate, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer separate to form those dural venous sinuses, We do not have that in the spinal cord. So we have this thick, fibrous connective tissue layer that serves to stabilize the spinal cord around the spinal nerves. If we look at the cross-section of the spinal cord when it is sitting in the vertebra, then you can see kind of how it's oriented. So we have the posterior side. You can easily, by now, in this point of the semester, tell that this is the posterior side because you have this really, really nice landmark structure, the spinous process of the vertebra, and then you have the body of the vertebra. So it's kind of just sitting right in between the bones. And you have the epidural space, or the space up above or superior to the dura mater. Then you have the dura mater, and then you have the subdural space, which serves to separate the dura mater from the deeper arachnoid matter. And what we saw is that the arachnoid is this very web-like tissue, which is why it's called arachnoid. And then below or deep to the arachnoid matter, we have the subarachnoid space, which is where cerebrospinal fluid where it circulates. And then deep to that, we have the pia mater, which is very intimately connected to nervous tissue. The pia mater, I don't really talk about this much, but the pia mater has this extension called the denticulate ligament, and that is what stabilizes the spinal cord laterally. And then what we see is this exiting of spinal nerves from the intervertebral foramina of adjacent vertebrae. And we will take a look at the spinal nerves and what they do and how they're numbered.